Sustainable You is a casual, interactive, yet informative series detailing and cataloging the sustainability experience. Moreover, this is a short podcast docuseries detailing the thoughts and experiences of passionate advocates towards all things eco-friendly. Our journey is to know how and why understanding sustainable development towards the triple bottom line of people, profit, and planet can contribute to a more mindful, holistic, and inclusive world. Specifically, this podcast showcases what makes you a changemaker, innovator, and transformer as you tackle sustainability challenges for current and future generations to resolve the so-called wicked problems. In today's somewhat playful episode, we discover that we gotta catch 'em all using the popular gaming app Pokemon Go, particularly about digital gamification and educational practices. Given that the media franchise just celebrated its 25th anniversary, Pokemon Go's enormous popularity and quick ascent to prominence made sense when it was first released a handful of years ago. From the Game Boy games to the trading cards, anime, and memorabilia galore, the majority of us, including myself, grew up with these adored so-called pocket monsters at the onset of the 2000s, so major nostalgia factor. However, the dominant attitude of environmentalism appears to be almost post-apocalyptic and full of doom and gloom, in contrast to the benevolence and positive outlook that Pokemon appears to convey in forging bonds with creatures other than humans. In its early days, Pokemon was particularly controversial, and we may play the devil's advocate and argue that it encouraged animal cruelty by showcasing domesticated pets as some sort of magical creatures competing on the field. However, as it has gained popularity, particularly due to the success of gaming apps like Pokemon Go, it appears to have had the exact opposite effect, with many people utilizing it to learn about and explore various ecosystems, habitat preservation, and how human activity affects wildlife, especially in regards to climate action. So is it possible to use Pokemon Go's purpose to accomplish environmental stewardship? Amber McLeod, whose work focuses on using technology to promote student learning and the development of transferable skills, was one of the Australian researchers and lecturers in education studies at Monash University, with whom I had a dialogue. She investigates the most effective methods for preparing pre-service teachers to use digital technology in the classroom. Amber's research and teaching interests are closely related. Additionally, the other researcher is Carabott, whose studies concentrate on how digital technology is used in homes, schools, and childhood. In the end, she investigates how this technology affects literacy, instruction, and learning. I learned more about how using digital technology, particularly gamification, through games such as Pokemon Go, may support educational learning and development as a result of today's episode. So stay tuned.
Be positively engaging, and again, you've been talking about that student-centered approach to getting an education. So for example, for those of you listening out there, if you're not familiar, I'm sure you are, the Pokemon franchise in general is known to teach children about relationships and social skills, which we've been talking about earlier in this episode, exploration and adventure, strategic thinking, and even arguably, I would say, grit and attaining confidence again over competence, because again, they really tend to foster that growth mindset, and of course being results-oriented and proactive and learning how to take calculated risks. At least that's the impression I got being involved in that whole media franchise growing up. So again, it's about honing your skill set and overcoming obstacles and adversity, and your article highlights a lot of this. So the question is, so how does the digital medium of gamification and gaming in general inspire and educate, again, impressionable youth to be advocates, not only for themselves, but to gain those new skills, and to become more, I guess, resilient persons?
Ooh, that's a good question. I'm just going to think about that for a few minutes. Amber, would you like to jump in?
Yeah, well, I suppose, all games, well, not all, but a lot of games really promote problem solving. So that's, a huge area really, is that you need to have strategies. You need to be creative. You need to be flexible. And, if it's a game where you're working with other people, you need to communicate. So all those soft skills, communication, problem solving, creativity, and so on, are big, transferable skills. Yeah, I can't think of anything else.
Yeah. For me, I'm thinking back to all the video game kind of research and the children's literature that I'm thinking about. I was just grabbing up a really nice quote here around stories. And for me, it's, there's something in storytelling around education, and certainly games and sometimes gamification, depending on what it is. Those kind of narrative games can certainly be really powerful. And there's this really interesting quote, about stories wielding power. If we think about, we've always been, quite an oral society, where there's stories, we learn lots through stories around that. And this quote just says, they carry hopes, dreams and challenges and can be deeply transformative. Through stories, we connect shared experiences and gain insights into diverse realities. And I think that's really interesting because there's this understanding. Bishop actually is a US researcher, and she talks about stories as being windows, mirrors and sliding doors. And so what stories actually allow us to do is they allow us to see ourselves within certain stories. When they kind of resonate with us when we're reading something or we see a story and we're like, oh, I've experienced that before, so there's that kind of personal resonance there, which is really important. And then those windows into other worlds. And so through video games or gamifications for me that have a really strong narrative, what it allows you to do is to see into other people's realities and other people's worlds. And so in terms of, say, sustainability, some of the research that I was talking about before around video games, in two of the games, you were playing from the animal's perspective. So, it gave you a really good insight, into an empathy around, what that particular animal was going. So that understanding of windows of seeing, into, other people's worlds is really important. And she also talks about this understanding of sliding doors. And I love this. And this is where your own world interacts with the world of the narrative or the game or the video game of the story. And this kind of shared understanding comes together. When we read something, it's not just about what the author has put on the page. We actively bring our own understandings, values and comprehension to that particular text. And so this notion of sliding doors is that it can actually be deeply transformative, in that it can change our understandings, of different people through the power of stories. And so in answer to your questions, a very long way of getting around to it, I think that, video games and gamifications that have narratives, for me, can be deeply powerful. But again, they have to be quality, and we have to look at, what does it mean? What is a quality narrative around that? And there's quite a substantial amount of research around.
No, that's really interesting, Kelly. We could do a whole interview just on that. But I think I really liked how you highlighted that storytelling aspect. And I think that's so essential, because when you look at, and I worked in mainstream media, and you just see how it portrays, the environment, and it's mostly, I would say, from the perspective of that old and destructive narrative, and that we're living in a damage control society. It doesn't really mobilize people to have that sense of agency and foster that, I guess, ethic of care towards protecting the environment. So I think storytelling is really essential. Even for me, like I mentioned, I come from Alberta. And when I was living abroad in Sweden, I tried to explain that, we're the oil and gas capital. And one thing that mattered to me was desertification, because a lot of, at least in northern Alberta, I know you probably heard of wildfires, and of course there's a one down the states going on right now, but they get really terrible during the summertime, because beside BC, which is like the province next to us, and a lot of the smog comes into our province, so it's all kind of connected. And like, oh well, where you live, it's kind of very arid and it's kind of like a desert. As you go up north, the wildfires get worse. And for me, I first, I remember I came across a game when I was doing my undergrad, and it was like an RPG, and it depicted the world turning to sand, desertification. And I love the storytelling aspect, not necessarily like the battling aspect, which younger children would appreciate, but I really like the storytelling aspect, because you don't realize what part of the world you come from when you go abroad, and you meet people from different backgrounds. But thank you for answering that. I'm glad you mentioned the storytelling. part of it, Kelly. Thank you for that. And then just going on to the next question. So how can gaming and augmented reality and even artificial intelligence, which is of course a hot trend right now, how can this help others adopt a sense of agency, as I mentioned, and genuine care for the environment, towards respecting the environment, conserving it, especially towards global warming caused climate change and the climate crisis in general?
So I think in terms of agency, I'm thinking about serious gaming. So there's a lot of games online which are actually citizen science. So for example, in Australia here every year we have the Aussie bird count, where you download this app, you sit in the backyard for an hour and you this is how many birds I can see. And then that's used to get an idea of what's happening around the world. Or iNaturalist is a really big one where you can look in your area to see where other people have tagged us, or a goanna here and a wombat there or whatever, so you know what's in the area. And then there's other things like, I don't know if it's still going, but there used to be one called Penguin Count or something, where they took photos from the satellite of, penguins in Antarctica, and you just get on there and say, this is how many penguins there are. Or I think there's one at the moment which is on solar flares or something, where anybody can get online and can say, there are 6 dots in this picture. There are 7 in this one. There's 9 in that one. And so you're contributing. You are doing something. So maybe in terms of agency, that helps a little bit, because a lot of that is then used. You can sort of see a lot on their websites. Often they'll explain to you why we need to do this research, so you become more aware of what is actually happening, which is always positive. You can look at the world and think, oh no, it's a disaster. It's really nice to hear when people are doing things. And in terms of AR, there's another, like geocaching is another AR activity that Kelly will know that everywhere we go, I try to do a geocache. And often, do you know geocaching?
Heard a bit about, but for our listeners, maybe you could explain what it is.
Okay, so geocaching is when people hide physical things. Sometimes it's like, a little gum container, or sometimes it's a great big suitcase, and some of them will have toys in them and so on. And you find them using an app on your phone which has the GPS position, and you can find it. So it's AR, but not that it projects a picture. It's just to help you find something. But AR in the same way that Pokemon Go is, in that the trigger is the location. So, you can have triggers of sound, you can have triggers of pictures, or you can have triggers of location. So that's what it is. And a lot of geocaches take you to places you would never normally go. People who set them up, anybody can set them up, but when you set it up, it's usually because there's something there that you want people to go and visit. And if you're out in the country, it's often like, did you even know this little lake existed? It's a hidden gem or something. And so you do get out and explore a lot more. And then even looking for the geocaches, because some of them are tiny. I found one once which was inside a gum nut. So I had to spend about 10 minutes staring at this tree. And even that act of staring at the tree and really looking at it carefully gives you a better appreciation of nature, of the tree. Because I'm like, wow, I didn't realize there were so many different shapes, whatever it is, right? Or you see some bugs, or so there's, getting out in the community, something like geocaching, getting out, not the community necessarily, but getting out in the world, the bush, but also that agency through a lot of those serious games.
Okay. Well, no, that was a good answer, Amber. And just for this next question, so you've already answered a little bit around it, but how does Pokemon Go reframe environmental awareness for others to be stewards of the environment? Do you find the game, like the gaming app itself, can motivate others to adopt those specific habits towards environmental conservation? Again, I've explained earlier in the interview, but when this media franchise started, it started with the handheld Game Boy games that were released by Nintendo in the late 80s. And then, of course, Pokemon Go came out in 2016, so a handful of years ago now. And a lot of claim that since then, if you see the trajectory of the media franchise over the past 25 years or so, that, this whole thing could be a double-edged sword, in which, younger children, youth can both learn about the biological classification of various, flora and fauna and animal species, as you had mentioned, but it also leads to the commodification of wildlife species, even including animal cruelty and poaching, because even though I don't want to imply that because I'm a fan of Pokemon, but like in the game itself, you're able to battle against other, like the magical creatures all battle each other. So do you have any thoughts on that towards environmental stewardship?
I feel like you can answer this one, Cal.
I think going back to Amber's idea around that geocaching, I think one thing that, the augmented reality, part of it, it gets you out into different environments that you might not have seen before to capture them. So I think, in terms of that observation, I think that's really important. And again, I think I go back to what I was saying before around it's the quality, of the game. And the other added layer to that, and I'm thinking particularly with younger people, but also with adults, is that dialogic discussion. So, that discussion with other people around what is happening in that game. And, I think it's really important, you can have some really interesting ethical discussions then, around, well, what happens if I poach somebody else's, or what happens, what are the ethical, kind of considerations around that? So I think it's more than just playing the game itself. It's also the interesting springboard then that game provides for you. And I'm thinking more from an education lens here, obviously, and you can discuss those kinds of issues around that. So, who's played Pokemon Go? What do you think about this particular aspect of the game? It raises some really interesting ethical considerations. How might that relate to our environment? And you could do some really interesting discussion and work around that by using that kernel of pop culture and that gaming experience, and then bringing it out and discussing it in lots of different ways.
Yeah, no, it's nice to play the devil's advocate. Like, I like seeing both perspectives, so that's great to hear that. And just, I guess, building a bit more.
I was going to say, I think Kelly's point is really good. And I remember when she was playing some of these games like Alba and Gibbon and so on, I suppose it provided a talking point. She then had something, and she came and said to me, oh, I couldn't believe how emotional I got about this game. So perhaps, like, I totally agree what she's saying. It's the conversations around the game that are important. But in terms of motivating someone to do something, playing the game allows you an insight into maybe some of the issues that you might not have had before. And so it's perhaps just the impetus to start those conversations.
No, I like how both Amber and Kelly, how they've explained it, how you mentioned it kind of ignites that opportunity for dialogue. For example, if you go to northern Canada and you see the polar bear, you can kind of explore, if not that they're extinct, but they're endangered, and you can go and you can kind of explore that aspect. And I think Pokemon Go allows for that kind of communication and dialogue, and to start that and mobilize people across the divide, really. And I think that's a good point. And I've always seen it like that, to kind of quell the controversy I've seen. Maybe not now, but I think Pokemon Go does that through augmented reality, and your article highlights a lot of that, so that's great. And just on this next question, so it's kind of tied to what you were mentioning about citizen science earlier. So what is your perspective on Pokemon Go, and maybe even games like it, mobilizing citizen science and environmental activism toward concepts like just sustainabilities and environmental justice? So I think you had mentioned this already in your article, but when the game was first released, there's research indicating that there's a sheer amount of data that was being collected by users. So because of, the whole citizen science aspect, do you want to go more into that?
I think it motivates or it mobilizes people into doing something mainly through awareness. So, whether it's awareness because I'm playing Pokemon Go and I went out and found this tree, I don't know, or whether it's, I was playing a game like Gibbon and it made me feel this way, that maybe that awareness or that experience, maybe it's the experience of it, then motivates you to do something or mobilize. If you feel strongly enough about it, then you're going to go and do something about it. So I think maybe that's where the value is. And while you could say, you could learn what to do, how you could mobilize in a game, it then has the danger of becoming, an educational game. And educational games are not as successful as just games, right? So you have to think about what you want to use it for, I guess. Are you using this in an education setting, or is this like outside a formal education setting, or is it something that kids are doing outside school and then you're just talking about it in class? I think there's a few different ways, but mainly I think it's the exposure and the experience that would help to mobilize people.
I think building on that, Amber, there's that, I know we've talked about this today, is that sense of agency, that you're actively involved. So, in terms of that citizen science, when Amber was talking about all of those, different things that that you can be doing, like counting the birds. You become an active part in that process. And that's really important. You get that buy-in then, and you're more willing to, to try different things and observe that, because your attention has been brought, to that kind of aspect. And certainly, I'm thinking back to, although it's not the citizen science, the game that Amber was talking about that I was playing, Gibbons, and it's, you're actually a gibbon, who's swinging through the forest, and you're having to do all of these different things. But it's the fact that you have agency with the gibbon. So you are the gibbon. So, you have an active involvement. It's not like a video, for example, where you might just be watching it. Actually, there's something about gaming where you actually have to do something and you're involved in that process, that speaks to you, and you're more inclined to maybe go and think about different things in different ways or try different things because of that experience.
Okay, great. And is activism, like climate action activism, is it really big in Australia? I didn't really know. Is it like you have Extinction Rebellion? I imagine it's similar to Canada. Okay, great. And I'm curious about this because I had no idea that you integrate sustainable development and environmentalism into your public education programming, but this is more around, I guess, public policy. So are there any current and potential policy interventions that promote sustainable practices and trends toward, I guess, would it help with digital gaming and technology and youth activism, all toward protecting and conserving the environment? Do you think somehow it can help others get more involved in advocacy and setting those regulations? So I'll give you a bit of an example. I don't know, again, how it is in Australia, but in Canada, I remember when I worked in a newsroom a couple of years ago, I had to break a news story where we had a nationwide single-use plastics ban. So it was pretty big, and we kind of still see the lingering effects of it. Like we have the reusable bag sort of thing, but it's mostly cutlery and stuff like that. Put a total ban on it. I think it was end of 2022. But then about less than a year later, what happened is that it got upturned because there's a lot of big corporate, of course, oil and gas interests that were involved. So that was like, oh no, I'm like, oh, finally we're making strides. We can be like Sweden and all these other countries. But yeah, so it kind of just made me wonder, like, how can we use these tools to kind of, set those regulations and have better governance? Because I find that Canada is a bit lagging behind in that regards. And I think we can learn from places like Australia and maybe Scandinavia and other parts of the world. So do you have any thoughts on that?
I think, probably our government's facing similar kind of pressures that yours are. Yeah, we have bans on single-use plastic bags, and it's very common to have paper straws and bamboo forks or whatever. There's a big push, has been for years, for people to have their own keep cups, and like at a lot of places you can take your own containers into a takeaway shop and they'll fill up the container for you. So that kind of thing is pretty common. But I actually think it's more, certainly what I've noticed in schools is a lot of it is school policy. So, for example, I know when my kids were at school, they used to have challenges in the classroom to see who could have the least amount of rubbish in their classroom. And, they'd have competitions to see who had the smallest bag by the end of the week or whatever. Or they really encouraged, I forget, it had a catchy name, I forget what it was, but this other thing where you have, maybe it was a naked lunchbox or something like that, where you had a lunchbox, but nothing was wrapped in the lunchbox. So you had a sandwich, but it wasn't wrapped in plastic or whatever. So everything was in reusable containers. So I think at that school level, it's more relevant. It's reaching the kids and the parents, because the parents have to pack that lunchbox, right? And maybe that has more of an impact than the big, of course we need the big policy things, but I sometimes feel like, with big institutions like universities, but also big, with governments, they're huge, and it takes a long time to get everybody to agree to do whatever. And society is moving ahead much faster than the government is. So I don't know that we're waiting for the government to say, hey, do this, do that. Reusable bags were popular before they made the single-use plastic rule. So I think, yes, there are big policy things, but I think it's actually the community level that is leading the way.
Okay, interesting.
That's an interesting way of looking at that, because my first reaction to your question was, I was like, well, that's not my area of specialism at all. I couldn't talk to you about policy around sustainability. But Amber, talking about the schools, I think is really interesting. I know, and again, depending on the school, but, there's a lot of schools that I know of that have kitchen gardens, that students are going out, and they are, growing their own vegetables and talking about things around food growth and food scarcity, and issues like that, through their own kind of communities. Again, we have, as you've mentioned, the wildfires, we have, bushfires in Australia, quite substantial. We have, flooding. And so, in terms of, children's literature, there's lots of different types of stories that are coming out, to help students to kind of talk about, those issues from a really local area. So I think what Amber's saying, it's, I can talk about it from the bottom up rather than the top, kind of down in terms of that policy.
No, it's definitely very insightful to hear your perspectives, and thank you for sharing. And I think there's so much potential, and you already highlighted this in your article, but things like with Pokemon Go and gamification and teaching others to be more mindful of their, mindfully consuming and their ecological footprint. And I think there's so much potential in that regard. And just to add on that, it's funny because your researchers, we had originally looked at, and I know, I don't know if you're familiar with this, but things like, I'm sure in Australia you have them, but we originally wanted to research how is motivation and behavior tied to adopting those sustainable practices and habits. So why, for example, in the island I was living on, why are they really into biking? But in Canada, where I live in Alberta, we love our big gas guzzling Hummers, and people will take their car across the street. It's so bad. They will not walk. They will take their car. And I didn't understand this backlash students had there against North America and why they thought we were wasteful until I lived there. I'm like, oh my God, they don't have a clothing dryer machine and whatnot. They bike everywhere. It's in the winter. We don't bike in the snow in Canada. It's it was such a lifting curve for me. We're discussing how things it'd be cool to have a Pokemon Go where you're teaching people to take on those sustainability challenges. So I'm sure you heard of things like Movember and those viral challenges or viral campaigns for a good cause. So for example, there's this girl in the UK, she went without makeup, no makeup day, to raise funds for breast cancer awareness. There's so many. There's the ice bucket challenge. There's so much. But what I like is they have that gamification and educational aspect tied to it through these viral campaigns. And there's so much potential and I think that Pokemon Go has started it, but to get people to be interactive and to adopt take on the sustainability related challenges. So I think it kind of opened the floodgates for that, hopefully. I think so. But I would love to hear your thoughts on that, because I'm just about to wrap up the interview. But if you want to add anything, that would be great.
Certainly from the research I was talking about before, around the video games with sustainability. I mean, the UN, have a whole website around different video games and what they would promote. And, this is, what is they're considering a quality game. And they've certainly talked about how video games have the potential to meet the 2030 SDG goals, and have the potential to kind of work within that space. So, I think from that really meta level, the really big level that, we have large organizations like the UN saying that, digital games, gamification really have substantial potential to speak within this particular area.
I'm just thinking about your comment about the backlash against it and how perhaps we can counter that. It's such a social thing, isn't it? There are certainly some areas in Australia where people are dying to open a new coal mine. I'm not really sure, how do you get on top of that? But I think a lot of sustainability practices are becoming quite normalized. For example, I was really surprised that Trump brought in that thing where he said he wanted the plastic straws back, because I can't even remember the last time I've used a plastic straw in Australia. It's just normal that you don't, right? Or you don't even use straws at all. And so I think it's just time. A lot of it is time. Certainly in Australia, for example, solar power is huge because it's so sunny, and the government provides lots of subsidies for people to have it on their roofs. And we've now got to the point where our energy system can't handle all the electricity coming in from everybody's houses. So the whole system has to be sort of rethought because they just get an overload of electricity coming into the system. I think if you see, if you're playing a game and you see a solar panel on a roof, if you're seeing that kind of thing all the time, if it's portrayed in, for example, games or anything, TV shows, then it slowly creeps into your brain and you start to think, oh, that's normal. I guess for some people, they're living in a culture where they don't ever see that. So it's, exposure. Again, it's exposure. Yeah, I think the video games really help with exposure.
Yeah, no, and I like that you mentioned it's about normalizing the behavior, and I think maybe it's a bit of a catch-up, but I think Canada, Australia, and I don't know about the US, because they don't have recycling in some parts of the country, but I think it's a matter of, maybe we'll get there and to see how, these other countries have kind of set the precedent, so I think that would be great. And so just on this last question, so what is the future vision for digital technology and augmented reality for schooling and learning and educational purposes? Do you have any final thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I actually just wrote a chapter about using augmented reality in schools. So certainly, as we were saying before, it's another tool, right? It's another thing teachers can use. It's not replacing anything. It's an extra thing. So when you go into the classroom, you're thinking, this is the concept I want to teach. How many different ways can I teach it, in the hope that every kid in the classroom will encounter some way that works for them, right? And this is just more ways. But a really big aspect of AR, I think, is getting students to make their own AR. And that idea that the students are able to create content. So they're not just, AR is not passive, but you're not just the user. You can also create the stuff yourself. And, as time goes on, it's easier and easier to create things, right? Websites all over the place, free websites where you can just go and create things. So I think in the future, maybe there'll be more AR. I don't know. I don't know that it's real. Like, it was popular for a while. QR codes are not going away, right? I remember saying to Kelly, we've been teaching them about QR codes forever, but it wasn't until the pandemic, when everybody needed to use them, that suddenly it's like, oh, QR codes. It's like, they've been around for ages. There are always triggers that are going to make things popular or not popular. Yeah, I wouldn't say it's hugely popular in Australia, apart from like QR codes. It has potential. It's not something that needs to be there, but it's an option.
Great. And Kelly, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think Amber has captured, all of my thoughts on that. I certainly think, as Amber has said, that education in particular is a really complex space where we're thinking about lots of different things. And so digital technologies, AR, VR, Gen AI, the whole suite around different technologies using multimodal text. It's about thinking about, as Amber has said, what is it that we want to be teaching? Is this the best tool? Is this the best way? In what way do I want to use it, in the classroom or to educate? Do I use it as a springboard, for dialogic discussion? Do we use it just, as something that the students are using? Is it more inquiry based? Is it experimental learning? Or is it more kind of, this kind of didactic, explicit teaching? So thinking about that it is one part in a very complex educational process.
Yeah, no, I like your final thoughts on that. And I think there's so much fear mongering in the media with AI and, all this stuff, facing jobs potentially. But I think there's so much potential for it. Like you said, Amber had mentioned, it's not necessarily a swap. It's more of like a supplement. And I think people need to change their perspective on that, because I think even things with like GPT coming out and people were in panic mode, but I think there's so much potential for it. And again, it's multifaceted, as you mentioned. Okay, so I'm done on my end. Just to quickly wrap up, do you have any final thoughts that you'd like to share, something maybe that I missed that we didn't really talk about?
I feel like we covered a lot.
I guess one thing that maybe I'd like to mention is, and I'm sure other countries have similar things to this. So in Australia, we've got like a museum for screen culture, ACME, and they have this fantastic online digital learning lesson bank where teachers have taken games, like real games, not educational games, and made lesson plans around them. And it's a really good, if you go and have a look at it, it's all free, but you get to see how these game texts can be used, because they're all using them in different ways. Some of them are like, play the game and do this. Some of them are like, don't play the game, but watch a video of someone playing it. Others are like, assume everybody's played the game. Others are, make your own game. But it's a really good resource, and I'm sure other countries have that too, where you can get some ideas, because, games go in and out of fashion. Can't use the same game forever. Except maybe Minecraft, which seems like it's just going to go on forever. But you do have to think about, look at it in a deeper way. How is this game text being used? And like Kelly mentioned before, is it a springboard? Is it a whatever? But just to see how other people are using them gives you so many ideas about, oh, great, so you find a game you really want, you want to teach about sustainability, but you don't have to find another game that's about sustainability to get ideas. Just find a game and look at how it's been used and then adapt that across to what you actually want to teach.
Interesting. Great. So what was that called again? I'll link to it because I don't think we have something like that, at least where I'm from. Do you know what it's called?
Okay, so it's the Australian Centre for Moving Images. So
okay.
I think that's what it's called. ACMI, ACMI.
Okay, I'll see if we have the Canadian.
I can send you the link for it.
I'm not sure if we do, but I'll definitely link to it in case anyone's interested in learning more about that. Yeah, okay, great. Well, that's it on my end. Thank you so much, Amber and Kelly, for participating in this interview on Pokemon Go. I really appreciated how your article gives anyone a sense of hope and to be open to exploring the possibilities, and gives that positive aspect to gamification in general, because I know there's a lot of controversy around it when it was first released. So yeah, thank you. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much for tuning in to yet another eye-opening episode of Sustainable You. Again, this is an extraordinary and engaging info series whose purpose is to make sustainable development and sustainability accessible to the average person in their quest to quench their knowledge on environmentalism. Be sure to leave your feedback by liking this week's released edition and by subscribing to this podcast. Again, any love from our followers is much appreciated. Signing off until next time.